The call-out culture of social media and partisan politics makes every interaction potentially explosive. Say the wrong thing or speak up on a topic that's not deemed yours, and look out. It's electric, but is it doing anyone any good? Author and educator Irshad Manji's new book asks such questions. It's called Don't Label Me, an incredible conversation for divided times. And she joins us now. Welcome back to TVO.
I'm so happy to be here.
I think you're one of the few guests that we've had here who's had hugs from the crew and even like applause, so it's nice to have you back.
We have a history.
Well, this book is so fascinating. At times, it made me very uncomfortable. And there were times when I was like, yes, preach. But you wrote this book as a conversation between yourself and your dog, Lily, who's passed away. Yeah. Why did you frame the conversation between yourself and your dog?
Well, first of all, I did not want this book to become a rant. And I'm very capable of one, so let's avoid that. But also because, in this book, Nam, I am asking readers to risk having uncomfortable conversations with people with whom they disagree, or more to the point, with people who disagree with them. So often today, right, we take disagreement as a source of being offended, and we roll our eyes or snap our fingers and walk away. And that does not do any good, because if you have something to say, here's an ironclad law of human psychology. To be heard, you must first be willing to hear. Yeah, but back to Lily for a second, right? So, I wanted to role model a conversation. And really one of my other big points in the book is that we have something to learn from everyone. And in this case, that includes my dog. My labels for her were old and blind. But I'll tell you something. She, in addition to factually being that, she was so much more. She was sassy and feisty. I would, clap my hands in order to bring her in one direction, and she would decisively move in a different direction. And what she reminded me is that, there is so much more than meets the eye to any of us. So when you put those two things together, I thought that, I would never raise a harsh word to Lily. Therefore, in having a conversation with her in this book and having her challenge me and my positions, that we could really do something special and avoid that polemic.
But I'm also thinking that when you do get to that point of checking yourself and saying, doing some work, how did you get to that point where you said, I need to rethink how I am, living my life? Wow, or engaging with other people.
Right, that's a big one. Well, as some viewers will know, in a previous chapter of my life, I've written books about the need for reform within my faith of Islam. And those books have taken me around the world and in front of often very hostile audiences. And there was a point at which my health began to suffer because of all of the negativity and toxicity, that I was ingesting from those kinds of interactions. But I also knew that the cause was one that I remained passionate about. And so I decided, instead of expecting other people to change, maybe I'm the one who has to change. And I remember preparing for one debate on Al Jazeera TV in which I wasn't brushing up on all the content, I was checking in with myself emotionally. And I said to myself, Irshad, when somebody makes a good point who opposes you, say they've made a good point. When you need more time to think about something, take it. When you don't honestly know the answer to something you've just been asked, say so and commit to finding out. And in bringing some humility to the table, see what happens. Well, what happened is that I realized that listening doesn't translate into losing, quite the opposite. The trust that was built among various imams in the audience as a result of that approach meant that a few months later, I was invited to come speak to a group of imams about the need for reform within Islam. And we've remained on very friendly terms. The point is that when you can lower other people's emotional defenses, you will have a much better chance of being heard.
I'm just thinking of something that you said a moment ago where you said that disagreement doesn't necessarily mean disengagement. It actually means something else.
Right. Well, and that listening doesn't have to translate into losing. It's very counterintuitive, right? We're raised so often in a competitive culture to believe that if you take a step back and just hear the other person, then somehow you're being completely complicit in their falsehood or in their wrongness, when in reality, you're giving space for somebody to explain where they're coming from. And if you're truly interested in where they're coming from, then you're also going to be gleaning information about what matters to them, what they value. And with that information, here's the beauty. You can reframe your own arguments in a way that they can finally hear. So in fact, this is not about merely being nice or polite or even civil. Let's face it, much harm has
or
been
accessibility
done.
politics.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Much harm has been done in the guise of civility. No, this is about being effective. When you've got a message, you've got to be savvy. And that means being humane. Something that I think that a lot more of us who are political junkies could stand to learn.
Well, let me read something from your book.
Sure.
You write, some people oppose diversity because they are bigots. Others, though, are skeptical of diversity because of how we, its champions, practice it. We're fixated on labeling, and labeling drains diversity of its unifying potential. What's the problem with labels?
Oh, well, labels reduce each of us to something less than we actually are. And the problem with that is not so much the label itself, although labels can in fact hurt. If I call you a racist and you know in your heart that what came out of your mouth was just clumsily, articulated, and here I am bludgeoning you with this very explosive, emotionally explosive word racist, that can shut down a conversation right away. But it's the baggage that goes with the labels. So for example, I, as a reform-minded Muslim, have been called every label in the book, from stealth jihadist to an Uncle Tom. The thing is, I haven't participated in the baggage that goes with any of these labels.
Do those labels hurt you?
They used to hurt me. The reason they don't anymore is not that I've become numb to them or I've decided to keep a stiff upper lip, no. But because I realize that somehow I have not communicated myself well enough for the other person to understand where I'm coming from. So I often take the time to say, hold on, if that's how you see it, then let me just step back and explain further. Or when I'm listening to somebody who, confuses me about why they're saying what they're saying, or hurts me in how they've said what they've said, I am ready to ask them questions, not gotcha questions, but questions about why they believe what they believe, because there is something about them that I am not getting. Here's the bottom line, and I'm going to be kind of Kennedy-esque about it. Ask not how you can change the other person's mind. Ask what you're missing about the other. And in that way, you're bringing a certain, you're being humble enough to them to then demonstrate to them that they can be the same in this conversation. And it's not a sacrifice of power.
Okay.
It's the claiming of the ability to set the tone.
But also to, in that moment, be able to take a pause because there's probably a lot of emotion.
Sure.
Right? And nowadays it seems like, there's people are accepting labels. They want to belong in a certain group, from non-binary to pansexual, people in groups that, historically have not been seen by the mainstream.
Right.
So if their labels help them not feel alone, what's wrong with labels?
Fine. As I say, labels can be the starting point of further discovery, but they are often harmful when they are simply the finish line. And again, it's because of the baggage that goes with those labels. Somebody who defiantly and dogmatically embraces a label will find that more often than not, all the rest that they are will be vaporized in the process. And you see, the thing is, we're not products. We are not inert as human beings. We are constantly evolving. So be careful. As you adopt a label for yourself, which is great and ennobling if that's what you've chosen, but be careful not to fix yourself in time or freeze yourself in place.
Do people choose their labels or are people given those labels?
Both. Both, absolutely. And again, none of this is easy peasy or simple. It's a matter of constantly interacting and asking questions, not just of the other, but also about oneself. For example, if you see yourself as, let's say, African, I'm born in Africa, you're born in Africa. If that's one of the labels that you choose to apply to yourself, then remember that that will have connotations that you have not chosen, so that other people will then assume things about you. And unless you're willing to question what it is, openly and honestly, what it is to be African, you're going to be giving ammo to others to decide who you are in their eyes.
You mentioned something in the book that I've never heard of before. I think you identify as a plural. Am I putting words?
Plural.
Okay,
that's
so,
right.
Yeah, what is a plural?
Okay, so yes, that you could technically call that a label, but in my view, to tell yourself and to tell others, well, whatever else you think of me, I'm a plural, is to leapfrog over labels. Because what you're saying is, like you, I am a multifaceted human being. I'm an individual, and I'm interested in having you know me for all that I am, and not just a slice of who I am. And plural, of course, is the root of pluralism, right? Diversity and pluralism are not necessarily the same thing. If diversity is only about sticking labels on one another and leaving it at that, that is the exact opposite of pluralism. Pluralism is also a willingness to engage, and it's an understanding that diversity of viewpoint is as important, if not more important, than diversity of complexion or gender or religion. And you know, the beauty of incorporating different viewpoints into your understanding of diversity is that you're not singling people out now on the basis of their race or their ethnicity. You're saying, you know, the viewpoint of the loathed, straight, white guy is important, as is my viewpoint. So rather than flipping the hierarchy on its head, where the white guy was once at the top, now he must be at the bottom, you're sidestepping all of that, putting all of that aside to say, you have a backstory, and I want to hear it.
I want to come back to that, but we're already running out of time.
I know, there's a lot.
I'm going to go back to the book, and
Okay.
you write, multiculturalism, which many of us equate to diversity, undermines honest diversity. What is honest diversity?
Honest diversity means moving beyond labels so that you're not stuck in defining who you are or who I am based on any single category. Honest diversity incorporates perspective and point of view. And that's why, regardless of what your story is, in a pluralistic society, your viewpoint will matter. And so will the viewpoint of that straight white guy.
You also write something that I think a lot of people will, I don't know.
That?
Yes, thank you for that. But you say that multiculturalism undermines honest diversity.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's quite simply this. Multiculturalism, at the root of culture, is the group. Culture is how things are done. Who decides how things are done? It's the most powerful people in any given group. And if we're really interested in pluralism, then we've got to look at those individuals within groups who challenge the status quo. So too often, those individuals are drowned out, right? Because it's the group that matters under the rubric of multiculturalism. Really, I think that multiculturalism has had its day, and that individuals within groups are the people who actually deserve to be heard, especially those who are advocating for different ways of doing things within the group. And that is why pluralism is the order of the day in the 21st century.
Do you worry that people who might not like the idea of diversity, who don't like the idea of multiculturalism, will co-opt what you're saying and use it for their own benefits, for their own agendas?
Sure. One has to worry about that, but worry does not mean that you then silence yourself. My point of view is that anytime I see my work being exploited for intolerant or discriminatory purposes, I will engage about that, and I will remind the people who are doing the exploiting that I do not subscribe to their agenda. But rather than just leave it at that, i.e., rather than just call them racist or sexist or homophobic, I would say to them, why do you feel that it's okay to take the intent behind the work and hijack it for your own purposes? Let's talk about that, right? And that way, I get to understand where they're coming from, and believe it or not, I've done that on a few occasions now.
And it
both
works?
on social media and in person, and they often come back to me sheepishly saying, Thank you.
Even on social media.
Even on social media. And this is exactly why we've got to be cognizant of how human psychology works.
How does it work?
Well, I'll go back to that ironclad law. If you want to be heard, you must first be willing to hear. And in order to hear, you've got to ask questions, and not in insincere or win-lose ways, but in ways that really promote understanding, your understanding, and not just theirs.
Let's go back to the book.
Yeah.
You write, young white people risk becoming invisible in the American tapestry. They're denied the ethnic roots that kids of color can call on for recognition. What do you mean by that?
This was said in the context of a story about a young man named Sam, who, after a lecture I gave at the University of Virginia, he came up to me. Everybody else was gone from the auditorium because he was, kind of worried about how this would come off. And he said, why is it that in multicultural societies, right here in the United States, he said, that my culture, as someone from the US South, is never taken into consideration? Why is the best of my culture not given its due? And I said, what is the best of your culture? And he said, well, believe it or not, Irshad, we're very hospitable. I mean, you live in New York, which I was at the time living there. How many times have you run into trouble on the street and somebody said to you, let me help out? And I acknowledged that that has never happened. And he said, here, meaning in the US South, we would do that, every minute of the day. But that is never taken into account by academics and activists who promote multiculturalism. So here was his bottom line question. Why is it okay to promote and practice inclusion when actually you're practicing exclusion? Why do you call it inclusion? And this is the point, that what we're doing is flipping hierarchy on its head by now putting white people at the bottom, when in fact we should be challenging hierarchy at every turn.
Is that what you mean when you write, because you write this, we're imitating racists, the originators of the race ruse. Is that what you mean by that?
That is what I mean, yes. And again, many people will roll their eyes and want to walk away from that point. But I say to those people that, ask yourself, why is it that when you're angry and insulting and mocking and berating of others, why is it that they don't listen?
I think some people might say that in general, out there in institutions, we talk about systemic power, privilege, and all those things. So out there, they have the power. But
Who's
you
they?
actually, white, as you said, when we flip it, I guess when it comes to white men, they are at the top. But you actually have a different definition for power and for privilege.
Yes.
What are your definitions for power and privilege?
And I'll give you that definition in a second, but I want to acknowledge that, yes, systemic discrimination does exist, but here's the question I have. What are systems and institutions and structures, if not the people who inhabit them? And that includes you and me. So if the way we're approaching change is by demeaning other people, then we are not going to have the change, because they won't change. Why should they, if this is how we're going to be treating them?
And I guess someone else would say the emotional labor of always, because even in Canada, we've had the Chinese head tax.
Sure.
An hour or two outside of Toronto, you have Indigenous communities who don't have access to clean water.
Definitely.
Once upon a time, black men who worked on the trains were called George.
Yes.
They didn't even have to learn their individual names. They were called George. No. So why
is it up to us?
Yes, why is it up to the people who have been historically marginalized?
Because we have power today. And let me explain. This goes back to your question about what is power. Power is the capacity to set expectations of what should be, and then to translate those expectations into what will be. It is undeniable that much social progress has happened over the last 20, 30 years in our lifetimes. And the fact that we're even having robust conversations today about the plight of Indigenous communities around the country goes to show that, we are on the path to making more progress, right? So if every single sustainable change in anywhere in the world has started with difficult dialogues, because if you're demanding change without the dialogue before it, then what you are demanding is that change be imposed on a certain group of people.
And
that is not sustainable.
And I guess that's you also write about this perceived invisibility in America right now for young white men, leading to white supremacy.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think it was Professor Janice Stein at the Munk Center for Global Studies who pointed out a couple of years ago. You know, she was asked, "What is the biggest national security threat today?" And she pointed out it's young white men. Particularly those who see no meaning in their lives, and you can say, "Oh, woe is me," and sort of deride them for feeling that way. But the reality is that when you and I point out that dignity matters, and we're actually talking then about historically marginalized communities, if we say that dignity matters, then everybody's dignity matters. So that when white young men are not feeling that dignity for themselves, largely because of the way we are advocating for change, then we're only contributing to the problem. We are not contributing to the solution.
You also write about having courage, and having courage involves being willing to offend yourself. What do you mean by that?
That means being willing to ask somebody who has criticized you, who has disagreed with your point of view, do they have a point? Should I be thinking more about what they've said? And in saying that, you are offending, the sensibilities that make you say, no, I am right and they are wrong. What you are actually offending, and this is a good thing, is this win-lose paradigm that we are all steeped in. That for me to win, you must lose. When the reality is, as Bruce Lee tried to point out to his own martial arts students, there are always win-wins to be gained if you can respect the other, especially those who are coming at you with something that threatens you. Remember, it's your brain that is basically signaling to you, feel threatened, because our brains have not evolved that much. And whenever we take in information, the first part of the brain that is engaged is the primitive part of the brain. And the problem with that is that it can't distinguish between mortal danger and mere discomfort. So when we feel mere discomfort, we often feel threatened. That's why we've got to outwit our own biology.
And you call it an ego brain?
Well, I call it an ego brain because our egos kick in, right? But the ego is nothing more than a function of the brain. And in order to outwit it, we can do something as simple as breathe. Slow down the blood rush in your body. And that will also allow you to transcend the impulsive part of the brain and tap into the more evolved part that will allow you to respond and not merely react.
You also say that universities and students at universities should allow, say, a white supremacist to come to the campus to speak. And you say that instead of focusing on them, to focus on their supporters. How do you find common ground with somebody who might be hateful towards you because of what they see as your labels, and in some cases beyond just verbal, when it becomes physical?
Nam, sometimes there is no common ground. Sometimes you do have to walk away, and I make that very clear in the book. Here's the distinction, though. Do not walk away prematurely, because you never know what change you're leaving on the table. I tell the story in the book of a young woman named Genesis and an old, sort of a companion of hers from way back named Lewis. He's a white guy who supported the Confederate flag. She's a biracial, hip-hop artist who advocates for a more inclusive flag in their state of Mississippi. And when she invited him to the table to speak about where he was coming from, over time, he changed his mind. Now, it would have been so easy to look at Lewis, whom I have seen, in a dirty ball cap, red beard. You could have easily said, that guy's a redneck, there's no point in engaging him. But it turns out that he was a lot more nuanced than that. And when I asked him, Lewis, what made you change your mind over the course of a few months? He said it was a respect that Genesis showed me, that she was willing to hear my side of things, that she was willing to understand why I believed what I believed. And in so doing, I realized that I began to care more about her than about the flag, which I supported. In fact, just a few months ago, Lewis brought down his own Confederate flag and put it away.
Those two people had a history.
Not really now.
No.
I know it's easy to think that they had a history. They only remembered each other from elementary school, and this was 25 years later.
But in order for this engagement to happen, I think what you call moral courage.
Yeah.
What happens then? I guess it's the expectation that one person will be able to step back and listen to the other person. What kind of tips can you give to people to, if they find themselves in that situation, to maybe have the moral courage to step back and listen?
Yeah, well, and let me explain. Moral courage means doing the right thing in the face of your fears. And often our fears come directly from our egos. So the first thing to do is to slow yourself down. Unless you're in a life and death situation where you have to fight or flee, you really can just slow yourself down by taking that extra breath. And then ask questions of the other person rather than making statements. And then listen to what they have to say and not treat them as a caricature so that you're always thinking in your mind, but what about this and what about that? Rather, listen and ask more questions based on what you've heard. And over time, maybe even over just a few minutes, you'll see that a trust is being built in real time so that as their defenses come down, they, like Lewis did with Genesis, will be much more amenable to hearing where you're coming from. You know, I think that in the lead up to the next election right here in Canada, this may be a neat experiment to try. You know, find one person with whom you passionately disagree on an issue that is going to be relevant to the next election, and develop a relationship with them. 1 hour, 1 week, meet over coffee, see what you learn, and more, perhaps crucially, see how much they learn from you.
Well, Irshad, thank you so much for being here. I think this book shows people being uncomfortable doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't do something.
That's right. And disagreeing with each other does not have to mean denying each other's humanity.
And hello, you have a blurb on the top of your book from Chris Rock.
I'm pretty pleased about that. I'm pretty pleased about that.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.